Governments in Sub-Saharan Africa have been urged to implement new taxes gradually. That's the advice of the International Monetary Fund, which says it's concerned about a public backlash against governments in the region as they seek to raise money to service their debts through increased taxation. But as Robert Nagila reports, financial and public policy experts also warn that the higher taxes could affect the livelihoods of many and affect economic growth in some countries.
Sylvanus Udwar is a grocer in Nairobi. He's witnessed a sharp drop in his income over the past year due to the harder economic times.
Since morning, I've only sold $14 worth of produce. By this time last year, I would have sold $100 worth.
He says that nowadays, most of his regular customers are very careful with their spending.
For many customers, when you tell them the price of a product, they say leave it. So a lot of produce ends up rotting and we throw it away.
New additional taxes and a recent increase in all taxes have forced the majority of Kenyans to change their spending habits. The government says the additional taxes are needed to allow the country to service its debts. Kenya is spending 60% of the tax it collects on servicing its debts. A debate is raging in Kenya over a new tax regime introduced by the government. At the heart of this debate is a fundamental question. Can you tax a people to prosperity?
The short answer is no.
Nikhil Hira, a tax expert in Kenya, says the increase in taxes is in line with an IMF program that Kenya signed up to avoid debt distress and access new financing.
They come in when the country requests them to come in. And it's invariably a country that is got high debt, deficits in their budget that are sort of widening.
Across Sub-Saharan Africa, several countries are grappling with huge debts and a high cost of living. In Ghana, protesters have taken to the streets of the capital, demanding the resignation of the central bank governor over the high cost of living. There's also been protests in South Africa and Nigeria this year over the rising cost of living. But the IMF is calling for caution as it remains concerned about the potential harm that a sharp increase in taxes could have on African economies.
We're having such a marked effect on consumption, disposable incomes, and the economy as a whole that it's going to be counterproductive. We're not going to raise taxes, they're actually going to go down.
With access to funding limited and available finance offered at high interest rates, most governments now see taxation as the main way of raising funds to meet their debt obligations.
That debt is a sovereign debt, meaning that the government cannot afford to default on that debt. So it must do everything within its power to pay off that debt. Unfortunately, paying off that debt means other aspects of spending will be crowded out, like recurrent expenditure and development.
Back at his grocery business in Nairobi, Sylvanus Udwar says he may need a second job just to be able to stay afloat.
If things carry on like this, I will have to look for something else to sustain myself.
For many like him, these are desperate times that sometimes call for desperate measures. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Let's revisit one of our top stories at this hour. Governments in Sub-Saharan Africa have been urged to implement new taxes gradually. That's the advice of the International Monetary Fund, which says it's concerned about a public backlash against governments in the region as they seek to raise money to service their debts through increased taxation. For a deeper look into this, we have with us Dr. Raymond Gilpin, Chief Economist and Head of Strategy at the UN Development Programme's Regional Bureau for Africa. He joins us live via Zoom from New York. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Gilpin. Now, the IMF and other Bretton Woods institutions created these tough conditions which forced governments to scramble to raise taxes and raise more revenue. Now, those institutions are saying the governments should not raise taxes too fast. What is the missing link here?
Thank you so much for having me here. I think this is a very important conversation, not just for Africa, but globally. We are in the wake of the COVID pandemic, which affected a lot of Africa's exports and also affected Africa's trade with the rest of the world. And in addition to that, the global inflation and tighter monetary policies in places like Europe and here in the United States have had an impact on the cost of borrowing for African countries, have also had an impact on reducing fiscal revenues and putting pressure on exchange rate. So African governments are at a very difficult point right now in which they really have to balance the importance of boosting fiscal revenue so that they can pay for the goods and services they provide for their people, but also at the same time doing it at a pace that doesn't undermine social and macroeconomic stability.
Right. So having said all of that, where does this leave the African governments now? What can they do?
I think it leaves them in a very difficult position, but it's not an impossible position. I think that there are 4 things they can do. The first is they must prioritize economic governance. And by this, I mean paying closer attention to things like the contracting for natural resource extraction and trade, also the reduction of illicit financial flows, and taking practical steps to reduce waste. The second thing that they have to do is look at financing, not from the traditional sense of you just have to raise taxes, but also from the perspective of how do we, as African countries, think through mechanisms to increase things like remittance flows, which are a lot more than development assistance. Also think about monetizing some of the carbon and climate mitigation effects through carbon trading. The third thing that countries have to do is ensure that they focus on social safety nets. African communities and African families have gone through a very, very challenging period, and this is not the time to pile on more pain. It's a time to ensure that governments could provide the services that make things a lot easier for them. And the last thing that they have to do is pay close attention to debt, particularly domestic debt, which could be a drag on the government budget.
Right. So do you see this backlash from citizens, which we are seeing in the region, dying down anytime soon? Or if it doesn't, how bad can it get?
That obviously citizens are feeling the pain, not just because of the policies of African governments, but also because of where the global political climate is at the moment and what's happening with global trade and monetary policy. These things will cause a backlash, but I think that's the challenge to African governments. How could they be responsive in a way that doesn't end up being punitive, particularly through higher inflation and the higher cost of taxes? This requires governments to step out from the business as usual prescriptions to looking at how they could enhance social welfare and also ensure that the fiscal reforms do not push too aggressively in terms of hiking tax rates, and because, you know, in African economies, an increase in things like food and fuel feed through the economy rapidly and affect everybody, but the poor disproportionately.